Hi, I'm Chris Sarandon, and welcome to Cooking by Heart, where we revisit the vivid memories of the food we grew up with.
I couldn't believe the tastes and the flavors.
Lydia Bastianich. Hi, Chris. Susan Sarandon.
And, of course, the people and the stories attached to that time in our lives.
I've been dying to chop this up with you for a while now.
Yeah.
How would you kill your child?
This is a lovely chocolate macadamia nut truffle that has dark chocolate. You can get it in milk chocolate too. I prefer the dark.
Alice Waters.
I was the one, sort of like mommy dearest.
He'd order one side of the menu and eat that. And then when he was finished eating that, he'd order the other side of the menu and eat all of that. Emptied the kitchen.
Food is the thing. Come on. We know that. Campaign.
My guest today is someone that I'll use a cliche in a way, the hardest working woman in show business, Caroline Aaron, an actress of unparalleled abilities, and I will show you why as I go along here. Caroline Aaron can currently be seen off-Broadway in Conversations with My Mother, after she wrapped her fifth and final season as Shirley Maisel in the hit Amazon series The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, for which she and the cast won the SAG Award for Best Ensemble in a Comedy Series. And she also recently starred as Pete's wife in the CBS television series Ghosts. On television, she starred in Transparent and has had recurring starring roles on Curb Your Enthusiasm, Showtime's episodes opposite Matt LeBlanc, as well as other television credits, including guest starring roles on The Odd Couple, Desperate Housewives, Modern Family, Code Black, The Good Fight, as well as on all of the Law & Orders. Her Broadway credits include Come Back to the Five and Dime, Jimmy Dean, The Iceman Cometh with Jason Robards, Social Security, I Hate Hamlet, The Ritz by Terrence McNally, and Woody Allen's Relatively Speaking. Caroline has over 100 feature film credits, including the recent indie hit Theater Camp, as well as Between the Temples, 31 Candles, and the upcoming Bookends opposite F. Murray Abraham. Other film credits include the Mike Nichols films Heartburn and Primary Colors, Woody Allen's Crimes and Misdemeanors, Beyond the Sea, and Tim Burton's Edward Scissorhands, and so many more. She is also a guest acting instructor at the HB Studios in New York. I welcome to Cooking by Heart, Caroline Aaron.
Hi.
Welcome, my dear.
Thank you.
So nice to have you on the show. Now, the way we always start is with provenance.
Okay.
Where we're from. Now, I know it was, and you can tell us, born, raised where?
In Richmond, Virginia.
Yeah.
The capital of the Confederacy, I might add.
And interesting, the juxtaposition in terms of your family history, which we will get into. But now, mom and dad how did they function in the community?
Well, we were Southern Jews. That was one of two. It's not a big, huge population down there. My father died when I was a child, and my mother found herself a widow at 38 years old.
Oh, wow.
3 young children. So she had to get a job.
Yep.
And the only place she could get a job at that time was at an all-Black university in Richmond, the oldest Black institution of higher learning in the South, Virginia Union University.
Mm.
From that experience, my mother became a big civil rights activist. And when we turned into the millennium from 1999 to 2000, she was named one of the most important Southerners of that period of time in the South.
Golly.
I had a very interesting background growing up. For the most part, was raised by a single mom in a time when women did not work, but I had a working mom.
Yeah.
So that was sort of an unusual thing. Exposure to a community that in the South is still very segregated.
Yeah.
I have to say.
Yeah. I know. Do you have any early food memories? I mean, did mom cook?
No, my mother did cook, but we had Gladys as our housekeeper, who we called at that time our maid. And, Southern cooking, may I just say.
Oh, yeah.
The fried chicken is unparalleled. I remember Gladys making us fried chicken at night. We loved it. There was a lot of food around. There was dessert at every meal.
Oh.
When my mother cooked, every recipe seemed to have cream of mushroom soup as one of the ingredients.
Right.
Remember that?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
My grandparents lived with us And when my, father had his first heart attack, I was really little. But then my mother was trying to, in those days, what did they do for heart patients? And how did we understand the relationship between nutrition and health?
Yeah,
It was not very sophisticated at that time.
Right.
But so we would have Jell-O for dessert. That was like the compromise that I remember my grandfather saying, that we were having the nervous dessert because she would bring it to the table and those little Jell-O squares would start shaking. We went, oh, it's the nervous dessert.
What a great way of describing it. And I remember it being kind of ubiquitous when I was growing up, too.
Yeah.
Jell-O was everywhere.
Everywhere.
Yeah. And as you probably remember, my dad owned a restaurant.
Yes.
And it was always featured. There was always Jell-O on the menu for, a prefix kind of lunch. And
where would you ever find that now? I mean, my father was in the restaurant business, too, but not in the same way. He and his brothers ran something called Richmond Fixture and Equipment Company. Yeah. And they put in all the appliances to all the restaurants in Richmond. So we could always go out to eat and we were guests of the restaurant and stuff. But it's so funny you said that. I think of all the menus I've seen and all the places I've gone out to eat, I've never seen Jell-O on a menu. Except for your father, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. I want to drop back just a second because when I was reading about you, because there are things I don't know about you, interestingly, your mom's family was originally from Syria.
My father was Lebanese.
Yes.
Yeah.
What was your mom's background?
Well, my mother was born and raised in Selma, Alabama, which she was from a deep Southern background. I think going further back than that, her family, although, not that she was aware of, was Hungarian, was their backstory. But my father definitely Lebanese and Syrian. Yeah.
So you need to talk to Wikipedia.
Yes. Oh, really? Did they make that mistake?
They describe your mother as being a Syrian Jewish extraction.
Well, she would probably like that just because it was connected to my father. I can say that.
Right. Well, was there any Middle Eastern food when you were growing up?
No, not that I can remember. I mean, not per se. Mostly it was all, collard greens, a strip of fat, a strip of lean, fried, more and more of that, black-eyed peas. All of that Southern stuff was always part of my growing up. When I got engaged and my now husband, who Jamie, came to Richmond for the first time for Passover, we had tomato-based matzo ball soup. That's the way they make it in the South. And
wow.
It's orange, and it came to the table, and he went, "What is this?" Matzo ball soup. What do you mean, what is this? I was so surprised he didn't know what it was. I mean, I didn't know. I mean, even what you could think of as traditional, Jewish foods were.
Yeah.
Always had a little Southern kick in them.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Could you think of any other Jewish food that had a Southern kick in it?
Well, we would have, like, let's say for Passover, we would have fried chicken and tomato-based matzo ball soup.
Yeah.
We always had, cream and mushroom soup casserole over green beans because cream and mushroom soup makes everything better.
Yes.
That kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I didn't really know, like somebody, even recently, Chris, very recently brought me as a hostess gift, a babka. I didn't know what babka was. I never heard of it.
Oh.
I know. Isn't that so funny?
Yeah.
It's exactly. But I love Middle Eastern food, and it's, become part of what I always choose to eat if I get to choose.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's also so healthy.
Yeah. And also, in Richmond, the restaurants that were there, all served, like the Jefferson mint juleps and fried foods. That was just the way it is.
Right. Grits.
It's a cuisine,
yeah.
Unto itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I've had a number of conversations with people with Southern backgrounds who talk to me about grits because, interestingly enough, in West Virginia, it was always part of the menu, particularly around breakfast.
Right. Oh, of course, it's a big breakfast food.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And there are all sorts of wonderful ways you can have grits, too. I love grits.
You do? Okay.
Oh, yeah. And now she laughs, folks.
Yes. Not my favorite.
The reason I asked about the Middle Eastern food was because when I was growing up in West Virginia, there were a number of Middle Eastern families in my hometown.
Wow.
There were Lebanese families, there were Syrian families, not a lot, but
right.
More than there were Greek families.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And so I was exposed a lot to Middle Eastern food, and I loved it.
I know. Isn't it an overlap with Greek food, don't you think, a little bit?
To a certain extent, yes. Yeah, because Greece sort of sits in that kind of cusp between the East and the West anyway. Yeah.
And I love that too. Yeah.
You talked about going out.
Yeah.
to eat? Where did you guys go?
Well, there was this restaurant in Richmond at one time called O'Brienstein's, which was...
What?
It was called O'Brienstein's, and it was a deli, which was so exotic. Cannot even tell you that they had like deli food. They had pickles and like sliced corned beef and things like that, as New Yorkers is sort of, just your drive by at all times. But it was such a big deal thing there. So it was just like a regular menu, what we would call a regular menu.
Mm-hmm.
And it would also had, deli food that people really loved. And you could also, I think, take out from there. Those were the kinds of restaurants. And I remember there was a Chinese restaurant that my mother really loved because we could all share food. But there was no delivery. Nothing ever came.
No. Nothing was ever delivered in my hometown either. No,
just didn't happen. So going out to dinner was an occasion. It wasn't like what we do now, which is cooking in is the occasion. If you're in the city and you're busy.
Right, right. Now, you had 2 siblings.
Yes, I did.
Both older?
No, my brother is younger. I'm the middle child, and I have read recently, we're the best.
Right. Just ask them.
Yes, I found that. Yes, and you knew my older sister who tragically died very young of breast cancer, and I have a younger brother. My sister ended up being a good cook, coming from my mother's house. I didn't really cook that much. I have not cooked that much in my adult life, but I studied acting with the great Uta Hagen.
Mm-hmm.
I first came to New York, and Uta would say to us all the time, other than acting, that the most creative thing she did in her life was cook.
Oh.
She really believed in cooking, and she would use it as a metaphor a lot when she was teaching us about acting. And she actually wrote a cookbook that I've yet to find, but I'm gonna.
Oh.
Yeah.
I had no idea.
Yep.
Now, what was the conversation like around the dinner table when you did have dinner table conversations?
Okay, well, our conversations around the dinner table, because this was so my mother was.
Yeah.
Like on United Nations Day, everything was a holiday. I mean, she could find a holiday in the most obscure ways. Like on United Nations Day, we had to go around the dinner table, and her parents also lived with us. So we numbered 7 to begin with.
Ah.
And then, my grandmother died young, then my father died, then my grandfather died.
Oh,
so all in 18 months. So we went from 7 to 4. But when we were, a full deck, it was always an opportunity for a learning thing. And we had to go around the table and we each had to say a fact about a foreign country to increase our awareness of the world around us. Like on George Washington's birthday, I remember this is so sad when you think about it now, but my mother would make these cupcakes, and in each cupcake was an aluminum foil axe because he could never tell. Remember, that's what we were taught. George Washington cut down a cherry tree, and when they asked him who did it, he could not tell a lie.
Right.
That was the definition of being a president.
Yeah.
That ship sailed.
And a patriot.
Yeah, in a big way. But that was our dinner table conversations were always about being in the world. And we had an unusual family in that, in those days, a lot of times I had friends who were fed before the parents. Like the kids would eat and then the parents would eat.
Oh.
They didn't sit down together, but we were all together. That was my mother's big priority.
Interesting. I'd never heard that.
Oh, yeah.
This is a first.
Yep.
In something like 75 episodes of the show.
Really? You haven't heard that where the kids ate first? Then
Never.
The parents got to have peace of mind and a nice, lovely dinner. But my parents also had something else that I remember growing up, which was cocktail hour. Every afternoon.
Yep.
And I remember the menu for I don't remember what they were drinking. Maybe it was martinis. I have no idea. Or, things in a highball glass. But my mother would have smoked oysters on, like little Melba toasts or some sort of hors d'oeuvre that would go with it.
Right.
And cocktail hour was first. They would sit down together. When my father got home from work, they would have their cocktails and then it would be dinner.
Gosh.
And I don't know if people do that anymore.
No.
They don't.
I don't hear this much, even with people of our generation.
You don't?
Every once in a while. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I find it fascinating because it was also a kind of 50s, 60s kind of lifestyle thing.
It was definitely.
Did your mom ever have people over?
Always. She had lots of people over. I mean, our house was a hub because she was so interfaced with the African-American community in Richmond, which was very, very unusual. We had a maid, as everybody did in those days. And what was really interesting is that Eloise would not let my mother's friends in the front door because they were black. And she didn't think they should come in. She thought they should come in the side door, That was those days.
Yeah, that was the mindset for the African American community in those days, which was these are separate, unequal
And separate. Even the museum in Richmond, the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, which is a really great museum, when I was growing up, had separate water fountains and separate bathrooms if you were going to the theater or going to see, because they had a theater attached to it. So that was just something that was sort of accepted when I was growing up by everyone but my mother, who found it, reprehensible. But I would say, yes, most of it was very interesting because she ended up sort of being a woman without a country in that, the Jewish community was not at all comfortable sitting down at a table with the people that she worked with, and the Black
people of
community
color
was not at all comfortable with being with the Jewish community. Those were traditionally adversarial communities in the South, and my mother put them together.
Interesting, because at least in the lore of the civil rights movement, the Jewish community has been at the forefront.
Absolutely at the forefront. But as my mother would say, writing a check is not enough. It was like,
yes.
you know what I mean? It was too intimate to have dinner with and be inside homes with. This integrated community was a very foreign idea.
It also occurs to me, considering that they were both communities that were ostracized for different reasons, that there was a kind of, I don't want to mess with this dynamic from both communities.
I know. It was so weird because what they had in common was so much more profound than what they didn't.
Exactly.
In the South. You know what I mean? Where it was, when I got married, the cake artist, the known cake artist in Richmond who made the most beautiful cakes, worked at the Country Club of Virginia, where Jews were not allowed to belong. So my mother had to find somebody to go to the Country Club of Virginia to pick up our wedding cake because she wasn't allowed on the property. And that was in 1980 that I got married. So yes, it was a long time ago, but it wasn't so long ago.
The country club that my family ultimately belonged to, that my dad aspired to belong to because he was an immigrant and ultimately did belong to, was restricted as well.
It was restricted, yeah.
Yeah. Although our closest family friends in the town were Jewish.
Wow.
Yeah. And there was a temple. There was a temple in my small coal mining town in West Virginia. And they were generally of the merchant class.
Yep.
Generally. Not always. But my mother's closest friends were two Jewish women who lived in the neighborhood close by.
I did this movie, as you mentioned, when you so kindly introduced me, called Bookends. And it was in November that I was making that movie in Georgia.
Yeah.
Hour and a half outside of Atlanta. Mm-hmm. And there was a scene in a synagogue, and the rabbi of this synagogue in Columbia, Georgia, I went up to him and I said, I am also a Southern Jew. I'm so interested in this, that you have this congregation here. And he said, oh, I know. He said, I was really good friends with, and he named the rabbi that married my husband and I. He knew, because I guess, he said that, there was no full-time rabbi in Georgia for any of the synagogues because there were just not enough people that were part of those communities. The synagogue that my parents got married in Selma, Alabama, was just, torn down like last year for condominiums. Oh, wow. They tried to keep it going. But they said, all of the young people are moving out of these small southern towns. So there's no support for keeping these institutions going. So they're just sort of disappearing.
Obviously, you left home at some point.
Could not wait.
To go to college?
Yes, to go to school. Yeah. And I'm trying to think if I'd left before then. Not really. And, our family vacations before my father died were in Nags Head, North Carolina. So, really seen much of anything else in a sense. So I was like panting to get out. I knew the whole world couldn't be like this.
Yeah.
Couldn't be like Richmond. It was just like, as my daughter said to me when she graduated high school, I have to go someplace where I can find my people. She grew up in Los Angeles. She has no excuse. There were plenty of people there for her. But she didn't feel that she had found them at school and she wanted to go. And so I felt the same way, which is I went to school in Washington, D.C. And, at first I wanted to really cast the net wider than that. But I also didn't want to be too far from my mom. I just wanted to be within a car ride to go home.
Yeah. Yeah, because Richmond is not that terribly far, right?
Yeah. It was the anxiety of having her be alone. Even though I was the middle child, my brother had gone to prep school. She had felt at a certain point in his growing up, that there were 3 women in the house and no men. And she just felt like he needed a bigger male community during his formative years. So he was already gone when it was time for me to go to college. So I was going to be the last one. And then it was walking out the door and leaving my mother alone. I didn't want to, even though I always tell people, you have to make sure if you are a single parent that you continually encourage your children not to feel responsible for you, because you just can't help it. You just feel a little responsible for them.
Absolutely. Understood. Totally understood. So now you're in Washington, D.C.
Yes.
Are you in a dormitory?
Yes, a dorm.
At
absolutely. First? And eating, probably, I would say one of the most exciting things about college for me was the vending machines. 24/7. You can get food anytime you want if you just have change. And vending machines. I never had that before. That was so exciting. And I just thought it was so wonderful.
Were you restricted to the kinds of foods you could eat when you were at home? That is, for instance, we had no candy in my house, except for every once in a while, Greek pastries and stuff like that.
That's so smart. No, we were not, unfortunately. And so, everybody in my family had a weight problem. I went to diet camp when I was like 13 and 4. How old was I? I can't even remember now. It was called Seascape. And my mother would send me there in the summer and I'd come home. I would be like, 15 pounds thinner, which was a big deal. And then I would gain the weight back in the winter because we ate the way we ate.
And you're talking the Southern cooking.
Yeah. And dessert at every meal.
Yeah.
Now it was even at breakfast, dessert seemed
really
like a commandment that you had to have plenty of candy. And it was in bowls around the living room. Do you know what I mean?
Wow.
I remember when my grandparents lived with us after my father had his first heart attack, and I would go down to Nanny Papa's apartment, which was part of our house. My grandmother had candied ginger. That was her passion. My grandfather had bowls of nuts everywhere, but it was Food was out and there was no sense of what was good or bad.
Right.
None.
Right. Yeah. You could call it all food.
I remember, any food you wanted, glazed donuts on the counter, just a plethora of temptation, may I just say.
Yeah. Now, when your mom visited, was there any predilection on her part to take you to various historical, there's lots of history around DC. Obviously there is in Richmond as well, but was she still politically minded when she came to DC to visit you?
Yes. She was politically minded from the time she was a little girl. I have newspaper articles on her where she grew up in Macon, Georgia, after being born in Selma, Alabama.
Yeah.
And she's nominated to represent the country through the Red Cross when she was 12. And she went to a national convention. And she went to college when she was 14. Remember when they used to do that?
Yeah.
They skipped them. She graduated at 18 from college. She got 2 master's degrees.
Wow.
Because she loved education. But she always, there was sort of an apocryphal story about her. She grew up with chain gangs in the South, and she saw a policeman beating a young black man on the side of the road who had stepped off the chain gang, and she jumped on his back and she bit him. And then they took her, she was 9 or something. They took her down to the police station. My grandfather had to come and rescue her. But civil rights and the equality of people was always very much a part of who she was. So we never, as my sister used to say all the time, we were never allowed to. We didn't like it that people called our mother a professional Negro, and that there were black people at our house all the time, and the Ku Klux Klan used to throw rocks through our window.
Really?
Yeah, it was hard on, when you want nothing more than to fit in.
Yeah.
To have this sort of narrative. And now I'm so grateful for it as part of my backstory. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And my mother, one of the ways in which she sort of interfaced with the black community was through food. She would love to learn about, those recipes. And, food was a very, very big deal in that community.
Oh, absolutely.
I remember us having ribs and beans and, all of that stuff.
I had a wonderful podcast with Ken Page, who grew up with aunts and grandmothers, and, the food was sort of just overflowing all the time.
It is love. It is love. That's what it was.
Yeah.
It was also a way to bridge communities. I'm going to eat your food, you're going to eat my food, and then we're going to know more about each other.
Absolutely.
It takes the strangeness off of the stranger, and I think that's one of the things that's sort of miraculous about it. And that was very much a part of my seeing all of these Black people at my house and them, going in the kitchen and bringing things to my mother to make bourbon balls, things like that you don't even
Bourbon balls. Tell us what a bourbon ball is.
Bourbon balls were, there were two kinds. Sometimes they were part of cocktail hour. It would be like a soft cheese that was made into a ball, and they would pour bourbon in it to hold it together. Then you put it on crackers. But then at Christmas, bourbon balls were, kind of cookie that were rolled in chocolate, and they were really strong. I mean, you could,
you could really taste the booze.
You could taste the booze.
Yep.
I did a movie a couple of years ago in New Orleans, and everywhere there were pralines, and I went, oh my God. I lived in LA. I've never seen a praline anywhere except for in the South. My mother used to make them from scratch, and that was like one of the exchanges. She would make pralines, and somebody else would come and make something else, because that was sort of their exchange.
Mm-hmm.
Their cultural exchange was all through food.
Can you describe briefly what a praline is for my viewers and listeners?
It's brown sugar in a pan with butter. Imagine that boiling up and it becomes a liquid, and you have to stir it and stir it and stir it and stir it. It's very labor intensive.
Yeah.
Like a praline, right?
Yeah.
They would put a pecan in the center, then you let it congeal or, cool. All of this very hot butter and brown sugar liquid cools, and it starts out as a paste, then it gets hard almost.
Yeah.
Like soft candy. And they're delicious.
Right.
And so not good for you.
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah. But so good.
If there's a nut in there, there's a little protein. There's a little
tiny bit of something. Yeah, they might want. So good.
So now, were you studying theater at American U?
I was. I wanted a degree in performing arts, but no college in D.C. at that time had a program. So I went to all the schools. I went to Catholic University.
I did too.
Yeah, they had the best theater there.
Yeah.
That's where the theater was. AU had the technical theater aspects because they had a shop. George Washington had something else that I can't remember. So we would take classes, and we had, now I think a lot of colleges that are in the same town have these consortiums where you are allowed to take classes, but I don't think that was done so much. And last year, I'm very honored to say that I was given an honorary degree by American, and I was their graduation speaker. And now they have a huge performing arts building. I guess all of these schools in the meantime have created these programs, and, it's sort of a double-edged sword because you're so excited for these students. And then on the other hand, you go, is this for those parents?
Yeah.
You're going, was this a really good expense to spend all this money on an acting degree? I'm not sure.
My dear, when I graduated from college, literally my father turned to my mother and said, now what is he going to do?
Exactly.
What the hell is he going to do now?
Exactly. And, it's changed now, is that the world we live in, kids are sort of thinking of their education as a runway to being able to take care of themselves. I had no consciousness of that idea whatsoever. None. I remember when I was in college and I was home for the summer, and we lived very near Williamsburg. That's the historical trip you take. So I've memorized everything about Williamsburg. I went so many times. But I auditioned one summer to play Betsy Ross 5 times a day, sewing the 13th star into the flag. So hot. It's like one of the things you could do.
I love it.
Got the job as Betsy Ross, and it was paying $65 a week, and I didn't want to do it.
Really?
And I remember when I got the job, and I said to my mom, I don't want to do this. I want to be Eleanor Duse. I don't want to be Betsy Ross 5 times a day in a theme park. I was so indignant. She was like, I don't know who you think you are, Tonto, but you need to have a job this summer, and this is what you're doing. So I think that was my first acting job, Betsy Ross.
You did it.
I did it in Williamsburg, sewing that last star onto the flag, which I think they probably still do today.
Caroline,
Williamsburg.
The image will never leave me.
I know. I have pictures of it. It was pretty funny with those hats and everything. I know.
So
my
wonderful.
mother loved Williamsburg. She loved it.
So now you finish your degree at American, and then what?
Well,
what the hell are you going to do?
Now what am I going to do?
Yeah.
I stayed in D.C. and I auditioned for and was cast in an experimental theater company called the Washington Theater Lab, which was set up specifically in D.C. because it was the capital of the country by Jerzy Grotowski, who wrote a book called Towards the Poor Theater that was our god at that time. Peter Brook, a great English director. And Lee Strasberg, the founder of the Actors Studio. They were trying to set up under the auspices of this artistic director, Anthony Abison, what would be a national theater and where should our national theater be, but should be in DC, around the nation's capital.
Yeah.
So I was the youngest one. I auditioned and I got in and we got paid. Not really, but a little bit of money. And I stayed there with that theater company. But, we weren't so much actors as we were talismans of the spirit. And I really wanted some applause and to wear costumes and put on makeup. I was kind of looking for that. So I had friends that moved to New York, dancers actually, and I would go away on weekends and go to their, hang out with them in New York. And I just wanted the roar of the grease paint, the smell of the crowd. So I stayed in DC for a couple of years doing that because we were teaching and, it was unbelievably great training. And some of the theaters that were started in that time in DC still exist.
Yeah.
We were one of many, theaters that sort of sprung up in DC right when I was graduating. It was sort of an exciting time.
Yeah. My first equity job was in a small theater in Georgetown, in a church in Georgetown.
Oh, I know exactly what theater that is. I know exactly what theater that is in Georgetown.
Lovely little theater in the basement of the church.
I know
Grace,
it so well.
Grace Church.
That's right. It's Grace Church. Oh my God, I can't believe you mentioned that. Oh my God, I know Grace.
Yeah. And it was an improvisational. We did improv at night with audiences and we did experimental plays at night. And then in the daytime, to make money so that we could get paid, we toured the schools all over the DC.
Oh, we taught classes.
We did Chekhov's The Marriage Proposal.
Oh, yeah.
And The Sandbox.
Oh, wow. That's pretty sophisticated.
And they went over big time, particularly in the inner city schools, which is interesting.
Yeah.
And the thing that we were always, at least at first, surprised about, but later not, was that the kids in the inner city schools almost always got to the heart of what was going on in the play.
Yes.
Whereas the kids who were, quote unquote, more sophisticated in the suburbs were always sort of trying to talk around it.
Wow, that's so interesting.
Yeah, you'd ask a kid about what the Sandbox was about. They'd say it's a graveyard.
Yeah,
it's death. It's death.
The thing about DC is it became a thriving. in the years since, there's a lot of theater in DC until Kennedy Center blew up recently.
Yeah.
Which was the jewel in the crown there. I don't know what's to become of it, but a lot of those theaters that are started then still exist and are very much supported by the people who live in DC. So that was a great time for me. And I would come to New York and then I eventually decided I'm going to leave Washington Theater Lab. And our artistic director, when he decided to abandon the theater, became head of the acting program at the High School of Performing Arts in New York City. And he has many students that are still, as my mother used to describe him to me all the time, he's a Rasputin character. You don't know, is he good or is he bad? And I worshiped him, every single thing about him. And I did, one of the great things is, Grotowski, who came to work with us, was a speaker at the Smithsonian. And we were there and, there were all these people there. And somebody raised their hand and said, "What is your advice for a beginning actor?" And he said, "Never stop being a beginning actor." And boy, that turned out to be the truth, because every time you work, you start over.
Yep.
New director, new material, new colleagues. It's all different all the time.
Yeah.
So I had great training doing that, but I really wanted to be in New York. And the only way I could be there was to afford it. Unlike now, when you graduated from college, you were supposed to take care of yourself.
Yeah.
It's what I said to my kids. You will always have a roof over your head and food in your belly. But if you want to live separate from me, which of course they were dying to do, that's on you. And that was sort of the rules. I remember my mother telling me, all of us, that we could never live at home again after we went to college. We were like, "What?" She said, "Yes, because you have to remember to buy the toilet paper. And that's the only way you're going to learn." And I remember the first time I ran out of toilet paper and was using paper bags. I went, "Oh, there is something to this."
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. We suddenly realized how smart our parents were.
Yeah, exactly. Isn't that so true?
Yeah. What was your first job in New York?
My first job in New York was at a theater called Intar, which was a Hispanic theater, unbeknownst to me, because I just bought backstage, and they were having auditions for The House of Bernarda Alba, and all women. So that's a play with all women. I went, okay, great. And I went to the audition, And they said, "Do you speak Spanish?" And I went, "No, why?" I didn't read the fine print that it was a Spanish theater and all the shows were in Spanish.
Right.
I got cast, and the artistic director was so wonderful to me. So in those days, you had to do monologues.
Yeah.
You weren't even reading from the play; you were doing a monologue.
Yep.
I got cast, and I did the matinees, and I played Prudencia. And Inchar still exists as a theater, to this day. I think it was sort of an important theater then. And in those days in New York, they had showcases, plays that you did not get paid to be in, but they were full-on productions. Soho Rep was the second place I worked, which is now a very important and consequential theater in New York.
Mm-hmm.
Then it was a theater showcases, and I did Sadie Thompson in Rain. I would go to these auditions and do these showcases. And then you'd hope agents would come and start submitting you for paying work. That was the deal.
Yeah.
And I studied with Stella Adler and Uta Hagen. And that was, one of the hardest things right now for young actors, and I get it, is, especially post-pandemic, is there's no community because people don't go to auditions anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And even classes are online. And so you just don't, you don't rub up against and, crash into other people who are doing what you're doing. And
exactly. I remember so vividly so many plays or movies that I've been cast in or didn't get cast in,
right,
where I walked into the audition room and there were other guys there that I knew who I'd run into before, and we'd sit and we'd talk. And
I know
there was no real element of envy.
No,
there might have been jealousy, but there wasn't any envy.
No. And everybody was like, I remember, this wonderful actor, John Slattery. I ran into him recently.
He was one of the leads in Mad Men.
Right.
Lovely actor. Yeah.
And I ran into him. We were at a screening together, and his wife, who I also know well, Talia Balsam, a great actress.
Oh, I know Talia too. Sure.
Yeah. And I ran into them, and John said, "God, I'm so sad that we don't ever see each other anymore. This community doesn't run into each other anymore because everything has become, digitized in a sense." And so
you audition online. Yeah.
I know, you auditioning online. So for me, when I was first in New York, even when you didn't get the job or even when you were out of work, you belonged to something. So you didn't feel so shipwrecked.
Yeah.
Now, if you don't get it, you don't see anybody. You don't know anybody, and that's really hard.
Yeah. We'll jump a number of years because obviously during that time you worked and became more and more successful. You got cast more, and you've had the good fortune, as I read in your bio, that you've worked with some extraordinary directors.
Oof.
I wanted to ask you, for instance, you worked with Mike Nichols. You worked with Woody Allen. You worked with Tim Burton. Can you in some way talk about what distinguishes a great director, and in the case of a specific person, maybe use an example?
Well, one of the things that in the government of putting together a creative project, whether it's a play, a movie or TV show or whatever, I think it works best when it's not about the actors. We are the spokes in the wheel, and the person who's turning the wheel is the director. When you have a star director, a giant talent like that, it doesn't matter who else is involved. I was directed by Mike when John Travolta was in the movie. You'd think he would be the movie star. The star of that was Mike Nichols.
Uh-huh.
And so I always think that creates the best work is when there's not a class system among the actors. We're all in pursuit of the same thing.
Okay.
It's not like, you're up here, you're higher than I am. And what does that do to my creative output? It has to in some way have an influence on it. When you're working with these great directors, like I would say, I'll give you an example with Woody or Mike. I mean, I've just been very blessed because I learned from them. But, Woody doesn't direct you at all, per se. Or that I did a play with him. He was much more hands-on with the play. Woody tries to undo your acting. If there's any directing at all, he doesn't like anything that's false at all. That's
showy.
No. And if he had his way, women wouldn't even wear makeup. Artifice, he's like allergic to artifice of any kind.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't like close-ups because of that. Even as a filmmaker, he thinks everything in life takes place in context of a larger picture. Even you and I looking at each other's backgrounds are part of looking at each other, right?
Yeah.
If somebody was making a movie of this podcast, they might zoom in on you or zoom in on me. Woody would never do that.
Mm-hmm.
Because
he'd have us together in the scene.
Yes. And he would see, what's the room look like? What's happening outside the window?
Yep.
Sometimes you and I would be talking and the camera wouldn't even be on us, so that the audience could have a sense of what's the bigger picture. So he would only, if you were being artificial, he would say something to you. Otherwise, he would just go with what you were doing. So there was a scene in Crimes and Misdemeanors that did not end up in the movie. I was his sister. I was
His being
a Woody Allen's sister in this story.
Yep.
And my husband has died at the beginning of the movie. He's died. So now I'm a widow. I have a young daughter who's 12, and I'm at the point of having many dates. Only one ended up in the final movie. But when he was shooting it, before he revised it, I had lots of dates, just trying on men at that time. And one of them was the great actor, Bob Balaban.
Yeah, yeah.
And he had like a 5-page monologue to me. And we were in the most romantic scene. And we were walking along the Brooklyn Bridge at night with lights. And we are talking about maybe living together, maybe getting married. And we're talking about how beautiful the light is. And he says, remind me, his line was something like, remind me to tell you about the light in the Hamptons. And I say, tell me now. And then he has this like 5-page monologue where he talks about being in a car and being followed by aliens who abduct him and put him on a spaceship. And it was like, and then he finished. And my line at the end of all of it was, I have to go. And Woody said, the only time he really ever directed me, he went, you can take as long a pause as you want. I said, rock bottom. He went, beyond rock bottom. And that was sort of his only direction. He would even say to actors, just say whatever you want, because he wanted it to be comfortable in your mouth.
Yeah.
He taught me one of the greatest things making that movie. There was a scene, a big party scene, and he wrote a line. I had a line to him, how are you? Running into him. And he said, well, the last time I was inside a woman was when I visited the Statue of Liberty. And that was his line. And he wrote it sort of on the spot. And all the extras and everybody who was around were laughing. And everybody stopped drinking and the waiters stopped moving. And Woody said, no. In a film, if you have a one-liner, everybody has to keep behaving. Otherwise, the writer walks onto the screen. In a play, if everybody does that, they kill the laugh. Yeah. You have to be very still. And it was so interesting. It was exactly the opposite in terms of building comedy, that sort of thing. So, I learned incredible things from him, from Mike Nichols, very different. Mike directed by anecdote. He would tell you an anecdote about life or his life or something going on in the world. And you would connect the dots to the moment in the plane. And then the penny would drop, that kind of thing. And I think the big difference between working with the Titans and then, working with all the other people is that everybody is listening to them. In other situations, I've worked with actors who give me notes along the way.
Oh, yeah.
Who are behind the monitor going, good work, as if I asked them. And if they're a star, the director's too afraid. The director, I had a teacher once that said to me, you better get good before you get famous because you'll never get good after. And one of the things that's very true about that is people stop directing successful actors. I love being directed.
Yes. And often what happens too is that if they are the pinnacle of the power pyramid.
That's right.
If they are the money.
That's right.
If they're the reason the movie gets made, then they have final say.
They have final say.
And that's always dangerous. And I've talked to so many of our compatriots who've worked with big movie stars.
Yep.
I worked with a lovely director who directed a fabulous movie with a big movie star. And he said he couldn't do anything without being second guessed through the entire picture. And so he felt totally hamstrung the whole time. Now, I'm just going to ask you one more question along this line. And that is there a director that you've worked with that not as among, as you describe them, the Titans, where you would describe this person as being as effective and as much of a teacher, a guru, someone that you really feel strongly about in terms of being a great artist?
The minute you said that, I thought, I worked with this director who is now taken over Second Stage, but he opened Lincoln Center 3 Theater. His name is Evan Cabinet.
I know Evan, yeah.
Oh, you do?
Yeah.
I think certain directors, it's like chemistry, is that he so empowered the actors and their intuition. He empowers your intuition. And that was so exciting to me, as opposed to, there's some very successful directors, some I haven't worked with, but who I've heard about from other people from the day you get there. They know where you're going to stand, how you're going to do it, what you're going to say, and they have enough of a track record that people go, maybe I better listen to this. But it's very exciting to be with somebody who empowers your intuition and then shapes it. And Evan did that for me. So that was really great.
Oh, how great. I'm going to ask you the final question that I ask everybody.
Okay.
And that is the following. That if you're in a situation sometime in the recent past or in the present in which you experience something, a smell, a taste, a moment that takes you back to that table in Richmond when you're a young girl, what would that food memory be?
The matzo ball soup that my mother made that was tomato based and now I make it. And it is a big favorite. It's very different than anything that you would think of as a soup. And it's every time I make it, it's like I'm summoning her, I'm summoning my mother.
Yeah.
And I love that.
Yeah. And it's also so much the cross-cultural milieu, the world that you grew up in.
Yes, exactly.
It's a representation of it in a way.
There is a film and a book that goes with it called Shalom Y'all about Southern Jews and about, in the beginning of the book, they said the two strongest cultural identities in America, being Southern and being Jewish. And when you braid them together, you have, my mother always said that she thought the defining part of her life was being a Southern woman.
Yeah.
Which was, you can probably relate to that even from
absolutely. I grew up in a coal mining town in West Virginia, border state, but very much, I grew up saying sir and ma'am to everybody.
And I had white gloves and yes, ma'am, and no, sir. Yeah. I could not call adults by their first name.
Absolutely.
No, that was just not done. And manners were a very big thing for me, growing up. So the braiding of those two identities together is a pretty strong thing. And so I would say, thinking about the food at Passover, fried oysters. Bet you haven't seen that at a lot of Passover tables.
Right.
Yes, that would be fried oysters, anything fried.
Yeah,
would be the beginning. And it was very exciting, actually.
Oh, well, with that, Caroline, and by the way, would you keep that in your mind that I need that recipe? Because I post recipes from every one of our guests.
You do? Oh, how great.
I'd love to post that on the website.
Okay, great.
All right, it's a deal?
Absolutely.
Caroline Aaron, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Mr. Sarandon.
On Cooking by Heart.
Okay.